This is Dialogue. Dialogue, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News.
And this is Dialogue Assassination with political research specialist Mae Brussell. For KLRB, I'm Phil Kogan.
I'm Mae Brussell.
Who else?
Who else but Mae Brussell?
Good afternoon, Mae, and welcome again to Dialogue Assassination. Of course, I shouldn't welcome you because you are Dialogue Assassination, essentially. What is Dialogue Assassination for those who have just started in the middle of this series of ongoing programs?
Dialogue Assassination is a discussion of news that is taking place each week since the program last Saturday. It's a continuous series every Saturday afternoon, and we take the news of the week and discuss those things that pertain to the particular political assassinations in the United States, the killing of President John Kennedy, of the Senator and candidate Robert Kennedy, and the killing of Martin Luther King, how it affected the ascension of Spiro Agnew into the seat of vice presidency, and other political assassinations, the Panthers, or the Sharon Tate massacre in Los Angeles, which was a political massacre. It pertains to all the political assassinations. A lot of people are confused when I bring Manson in as a political patsy, such as Sirhan and Ray and Oswald. But I got a letter from Joe Justine. He has a newsletter from Germany that goes out all over the world every 2 weeks, and he's written 7 books on the political assassinations. And just yesterday, Justine's letter was the CIA gets into witchcraft and Satanism, and they're beginning to say that Oswald, they have a book coming out saying Oswald was under the influence of Satan. And Justine caught on finally that there's another cover story. The CIA is going to use the occult as the excuse for the motive of, they've used it as the motive for the massacre in Los Angeles, and Scientology influencing Sirhan or Manson, and these weren't the real reasons for killing the people we've mentioned. But now they're going back and trying to say Oswald was into the occult, and I sent a letter off to Justin and said, I've told you all along that the CIA will use this as their next cover story. They've used up the communist bit and the other cover stories, so they're going to the occult. I brought in a book. I just got it this week. It's a new book, and I like to recommend books for you to buy, preferably to buy, order from the bookstore, or go to the library and ask them to get this book. The library is wonderful about getting books for all of the various readers who are checking the commission hearings at the Carmel Library now, and one person I know has the first 10 volumes of the Warren Commission hearings. There's 26 volumes, and he's checked them out. They will procure these books if you want them. Now, there's a new book out by E.H. Cookridge. It just came out called Galen, the Spy of the Century. And on the cover, it has a picture of the German eagle, the symbol, that double eagle of Nazi Germany. And one side is black with a red beak, and the other half is like the American flag, red, white, and blue. The wings are red and white, and the head is blue. And under the title of Galen, I'm going to read you the book cover. It says, Reinhard Galen first served as Hitler's chief intelligence officer against the Soviet Union. His second boss in the same capacity was the CIA. And you turn the back over, and it has a list of questions that are covered in the book. Who was General Reinhard Galen? And I'm not going to read the list now. I'm going to do a whole show on him in a few weeks when I complete reading the book. But it says his Galen organization was financed by the CIA to the extent of $200 million through his close friend Alan Dulles. He's living in a home that Alan Dulles bought him in Germany. This man is wanted as a top Nazi criminal if ever he sets his foot outside of a villa. It's interesting, Reinhard Galen was the head of Nazi intelligence for Hitler of the Eastern Division. Then he worked with Alan Dulles and became he formed our CIA, the backbone of our CIA, with Alan Dulles, and we took his agents and incorporated them into our CIA. he's made one trip to the outside of his villa in Nazi Germany, from Germany to the Dulles estate that was bought for him outside of his headquarters. It was to Monterey, California, to the spy school in Monterey, California. That's the only place that Reinhard Gehlen has been outside of Germany since he's been Hitler's intelligence chief in Monterey at the spy school. It says for a quarter of a century he was involved in almost every major espionage intrigue. Now, why do I talk about this book? For people who've listened to the show for the past 8 months, I've mentioned Reinhard Gehlen many times and the Gehlen operation. There's a chapter of him in the book, The Espionage Establishment. And when you open the book on Reinhard Gehlen, the first chapter is on Allen Dulles. And the author says, you may wonder why I begin my book on the spy of the century talking about Allen Dulles. And he said, because Allen Dulles created Reinhard Gehlen. They formed the CIA together. And it's a fascinating book of intrigue, plotting, and devising. So it was intelligence, clandestine government that he devised for our government, like they did in Nazi Germany. Now, I got onto the Gehlen operation when I was cross-filing the people from the commission hearings that I referred to, the 26 volumes, the witnesses that were friends of Lee and Marina Oswald's in the not in the Soviet Union, the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I realized that they had come through the Gehlen operation, that they were all Nazis placed in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, or most of them were associated and filtered with the Gehlen operation. And when I wrote down all the Nazis who were involved in the political assassinations that take place in this country, they came through the Gehlen operation. So you can see why this book coming out now, there's many chapters on them, and there's 2 books on the stand, a paperback and this hardbound. But it's a very important book, E.H. Cookridge, Gehlen, Spy of the Century. Now, you read a book about Gehlen, and you read about the things that he was into, 70% of all the espionage involvements that have taken place in the last quarter of a century, and he supplied 70% of intelligence for NATO. Why is that important? Because when you break down the particular operation of a political conspiracy, you get to the nitty-gritty of the actual evidence of the murder. The way these intelligence agents work is they plant evidence against the innocent. They plant witnesses to say a particular person is guilty. They subvert the system of justice in a way that you don't know truth from fiction. And the actual operation of the intelligent agent is something different than the overall planning. So today I wanted to go into one facet, one little detail of how an intelligence operation like the Gehlen operation that incorporates with our CIA works. And I bring it up because in the news today, all the discussions on the ITT memo, what took place in Mrs. Beard. And I brought an article from the New York Times and one from the Washington Bureau, Mercury Washington Bureau, from the San Jose Mercury, on one subject, which is the destruction of evidence in the Washington office, that the International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation took sacks of papers from the files of the Washington office the day after Jack Anderson's column came out and destroyed them. And they said the primary reason for feeding the papers into a shredder was to destroy documents that would cause unwarranted embarrassment. Now, I'm going to discuss the destruction of the evidence in this ITT case, and then I'm going into the destruction of the evidence of the John Kennedy murder, because this is the way an intelligence operation, one way that they work is to siphon out of town or destroy or break any evidence of a system that is going to go before the courts. They incorporate their power. ITT has offices in Germany, Austria, all over the world. And we're not going to go into the structure of that particular corporation, but the lawyers went into that office and destroyed the documents. Mr. Abel, one of the security men, disclosed that some of the shredded documents did pertain to the San Diego Convention and others concerned the antitrust settlement. And Senator John V. Tunney of California said this looks bad on the face. He added that the international telephone employees could hardly be expected to acknowledge now that the documents already destroyed linked the corporation to the convention pledge or the antitrust settlement. Now, the interim reports were all burned, and the New York lawyers came out to give advice to the national telephone employees about the legal liabilities that would be incurred by destroying these papers. And in the morning, the next morning after Jack Anderson's article came out, the 25-member staff was told that their files were an open sieve, that they had to be destroyed. Now, Tunney made a statement in the paper this week, since I was on the air last week. He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I suggest that people who are listening that want to know what to do, they always say, is there anything we can write to government? Which congressman should we write to? How can we get the truth on the political assassinations? I suggest you write to Senator John Tunney, and you could send me a copy of your letter and his answer to the station here if you want to. He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he said that it was outrageous that they had an office document shredding party after the memo was reprinted. And Tunney said this, in quotes, "Under common law, when a person destroys evidence, they say that it is a presumption of guilt," end quote, that they come in. Now, I think we should write to our congressmen and ask them what happened after the President of the United States was killed, because I would like to, in this program, discuss 11 pieces of evidence that were totally destroyed or locked up that would prove or help prove who killed John Kennedy. And we're talking about, I keep saying over again, the President of the United States was killed. The most important evidence to me was the destruction of the car interior.
Okay, now we're going from IT&T.
The destruction of the evidence there that it is easy when a corporation is about to be prosecuted for an antitrust suit and they make a settlement out of court, and when they're being investigated on the nature of this settlement, they come right in and pulverize everything in the office, every memo and letter. So I'm moving from today's destruction of evidence to the way the government worked in 1963, because nothing has changed except that is a personal antitrust suit between the business and the government, and this is deciding who the President of the United States will be. And this is the way the evidence was handled when John Kennedy was murdered.
Okay, so this is destroyed evidence from the research surrounding the John Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, you see, it's important to go over this because some of this has never been chronicled or discussed openly on the air or in the news media, and people do not realize what happened when John Kennedy was killed, or how do you do your research to say there was a conspiracy. So many people listening were very young when that event took place, or never did any thinking about the solving of that crime. They thought because there was a commission appointed to investigate the murder that the murder was solved. But I want to show you what the commission had to work on, and the first thing they had to work on was the car interior that the president was riding in, because 3 bullet fragments were removed from the interior of that car. And we did several shows, one last week on the direction of the bullet, the impossibility that it came from a certain direction, and we did another show on the evidence of more bullets than the 3 that they said took place. I have a copy of a letter I brought in, a memo of a letter written to J. Edgar Hoover from Mr. Rankin, the chief counsel for the Warren Commission, describing bullet fragments taken from John Kennedy's car. One was from the front seat cushion, one was from the front seat, another one from the front seat. Now, in the hearings before the commission, there were 3 bullet fragments removed from the interior of the car. But the car was never tested to see where the bullets were located. They had pieces of bullets from the car, but they didn't say where they were located. To be in a front seat cushion, a report from the chief attorney doesn't say whether it was on the right side or left side, whether it was consistent with the direction of where Oswald would be standing. So if we had the car interior, we may be able to know what part of the cushion. To just say front seat cushion, or beside another one is a bullet beside the front seat.
What happened to the car? Or weren't there pictures taken or something?
There were no photographs taken of the car. The car was airlifted to Washington, to the basement of the White House. And the next day, within 48 hours, the car was taken to Dearborn, Michigan. And the interior of the car was completely ripped out. No person.
By who?
Well, if we knew who did that, we would be halfway to solving the crime. If we know who gave the orders to destroy the car, you see, we'd be halfway to solving the crime. This is the way I figure it. Who gave the order to lift a huge car? We're going to go to pieces of paper that were burned. And you can make errors. You know, your cigarette can light up by mistake. But the interior of the presidential car nobody knows what part of the seat the bullets were taken from. If it was on the driver's side and not on the side where John Kennedy or John Connally was sitting, then there obviously had to be a flurry of bullets, like the Secret Service agent had said.
Does anybody know why it was taken to Dearborn, Michigan?
No, nobody asks. I am asking, researchers are asking. Maybe there's 150 persons like myself who've worked continuously for 9 years, and maybe there's a few thousand others that have joined us since. But these are the things we want people to begin to ask. Why was it taken? Why wasn't it photographed? If the FBI solved so many other crimes and is on the radio, on the television every night showing how they solved these wonderful crimes, why wouldn't they photograph the interior of the car to show? You see, if you examined it, as a criminologist should, you could tell what direction the bullets came from, how far the gunman stood, and how many bullets there are, you know. But the car was completely destroyed. Now, we've gone into the fact that the x-rays of John Kennedy at the time that they were taken when he had the autopsy were never developed. Those are not destroyed, but they're locked up for 75 years, and the researchers can't have access to those x-rays.
Has anyone seen those? They've never been developed?
They were developed this year, and Dr. Latimer, the urologist from New York, was selected to go in and see them. But the New York Times called several researchers a week before he went in the archives and said, Latimer's going to go in the archives and say the Warren Commission was right. This is from a reporter from the New York Times who wrote the story for the New York Times. The story was written before he went into the archives. And he's the only man. And Burke Marshall of IBM is the only person that gives permission to see those x-rays, and they're locked up. Now, the jacket of President Kennedy is locked up in the National Archives, and that's something else that is available. It isn't destroyed yet, but the researchers want to see how many holes and the location of the holes. Now, the street sign and the lamppost were removed from in front of the book depository, and Mr. Kellerman, the Secret Service agent, said he heard a flurry of bullets. It would be nice to know what happened to the street sign and lamppost of this particular crime.
Why?
Well, I don't know why it was removed.
No, but why would it be nice to know?
Because if there was a flurry of bullets, and if there's more bullets in the car, it could be that one bullet hit a curb, and it went over beyond the deposit, in front of the depository down toward the street, hit the curb, ricocheted, and hit a gentleman on the face. His face was bleeding, and he needed medical attention. And the Warren Commission said he probably was hit by this bullet. There wasn't anything else flying around that area. It would be nice to know why they removed the lamppost, because there could be nicks from other bullets if it was a crossfire. You see, you could find out who gave the order to remove the sign and the lamppost and examine them like you do the street curb. Now, the clothing of John Connally, I did a lot of research into the clothing of Governor Connally. I feel that someday he's going to be president of the United States if we don't stop this madness. But Governor Connally was he was shot, supposedly by the same bullet that went through John Kennedy. And they were at Parkland Hospital together. And on March the 10th, 1964, Look magazine did an article on John Connally. It was called The Ordeal of Lyndon Johnson, but it went into the clothing of Governor Connally. And it said Lyndon Johnson was sitting with 4 congressmen, friends of his, in a retreat, which was the minor surgery room at Parkland Hospital. Albert Thomas, Jack Brooks, Representative Gonzales, and Homer Thornberry, 4 congressmen from Texas. Federal Judge Thornberry was a Johnson intimate. Clifton Carter was Johnson's aide who was in the motorcade. And he was serving Johnson coffee, and they were sitting in this room, the 4 men from Texas with Lyndon Johnson, in the Parkland Hospital minor surgery room. And a nurse entered the room, and she had 2 small paper bags, and she said they were Governor Connally's clothes, and somebody had to sign for them. So Clifton Carter signed a slip with his name for Governor Connally's clothes. And Mrs. Connally was sitting outside and could have received her husband's garments, or the FBI or the Secret Service or the Dallas Police could have received those garments because, again, in terms of criminology, the entry or the exit holes in the clothing, how many, would tell you something about where he was shot from. But these clothing were handed in a paper bag to Johnson's aide. Now, Mr. Nogel's article in Look magazine goes on to say that they ended up in the closet of Congressman Gonzales in Washington. The 2 paper bags containing Governor Connally's clothes ended up in a paper bag in the closet of the congressman in Washington, the Texas congressman. This is March 10th, 1964, Look magazine. Now, as I said before, all the law enforcement people were there at Parkland Hospital. It was covered with law enforcement people, and these clothing were given to a gentleman who flew to Washington and took them with him. Now, when the Warren Commission wanted to reconstruct the crime, they called in Mr. Frazier, a firearms expert for the FBI. He had 23 years with the FBI firearms training, 23 years a specialist in firearms identification. And Mr. Frazier was called as a witness before the Warren Commission. This is in Volume 5, page 63. And he asked if he had a chance to examine the clothing worn by Governor Connally on November the 22nd. Mr. Frazier answered that he had seen the clothing, but they had been dry cleaned and pressed before he ever saw them, so he had no way of saying as a firearm expert that they were cleaned. And they asked him to describe the clothing, and he said there was a hole in the back of the coat that had the general appearance and could have been a bullet, possibly because of the cleaning or the pressing of the garment. He couldn't say the direction of the path of the bullet. Now, he knows it could have been a bullet because John Connally wasn't going to lunch with 4 holes in his clothing. You know, he was very cautious. He says it could have been a bullet. Now, Mr. Spector, the author of the Bullet 399, that single bullet that we talked about last week that was supposed to do all of the traveling from the book depository through John Kennedy's back, up his Adam's apple, into John Connally's back, out his chest, into his wrist, and out the other side into his leg. It was, that Bullet 399 ended on the stretcher. That was called Arlene Spector's bullet. And Arlene Spector asked Mr. Frazier, was the hole in the back of the jacket, this is in quotes, consistent with a bullet hole caused by a missile traveling from the back to the front of the wearer of the garment? And Mr. Frazier says, I could not determine that. This is the FBI expert saying to him, I cannot determine that. Then the commission went on to the hole in the front of the coat that came out his chest. And once more, Mr. Frazier of the FBI, 23 years of the FBI, said, possibly because of the cleaning and pressing of the garment, I couldn't determine whether it was actually a bullet hole or whether it exited or entered that particular hole. And Mr. Spector was persistent, and he said, could this hole have been caused by an exiting bullet? He didn't say could it be caused by an entering or an exiting. The Arlene Spector says, could it have been caused by an exiting bullet? See, the Warren report writes up that the clothing of John Connally was caused, it could have been caused by an exiting bullet, the one in the front of his coat. And the answer had to be yes, because he didn't say could it be entry or exit, you see. So they brought out Commission Exhibit 685, and that was Governor Connally's shirt that he wore under his coat. And once more, they asked him, could he tell whether it was entry or exit by the holes in the shirt? And he said the shirt was dry cleaned and pressed, and the FBI never had time to examine it.
Now, all these things have been dry cleaned and pressed. Who had them dry cleaned and pressed?
Well, who removed the car to Michigan and destroyed it? You know, people, I refer to they, or people want to know they. I think it's up to citizens like yourself and myself to keep wanting to know who. They have names. You see, when I get back to this book, Galen, The Spy of the Century, how do you become the spy of the century? You do all of these things like bring down Gary Powers in the U-2 or ruin the summit conference of Eisenhower or plant evidence against somebody to make him get the death penalty. They have names. That's the way the espionage system works. You have to find out who's doing it, you see. I don't know who sent the clothing to the dry cleaners, but it was dry cleaned and pressed. This is a fact.
Before an expert
examiner
could look at it and reach some conclusions.
Before any expert could examine it. Now, they have names because shirts don't walk to dry cleaners. I mean, we know it has a name.
That's a safe assumption to make.
Okay, so before he had a chance to examine it, he said, I was unable to formulate an opinion as to the cause of the hole. So he couldn't even say that because he couldn't even examine the hole to see maybe a fist went through it. He couldn't tell by the time he looked at it what the hole was. So Mr. Spector, representing the Warren Commission, then asked him a question to make it more factual. And this is the question the commission asked Mr. Frazier, who can't tell whether it's entry or exit because it's been dry cleaned before he ever saw it. Warren Commission, Mr. Spector, could it have been caused by a 6.5 millimeter bullet coming from the rear of the wearer to his front? The man has already said he couldn't say it, but the commission isn't satisfied because they have to have him eke out some answer that looks like he had an opinion. So he didn't ask if it could be caused by a 6-point bullet coming from the back or the front. He could have been caused. The shirt is the front going through. So he did not ask, can you tell the shape of the hole, what kind of bullet went through? He says, could it have been a 6.5? And this is the way the questions were asked. At that point, the commission says, I want to go off the record. And the stenographer stops, and they have a huddle, which happens all the time, an icky question, because they're not getting very far here. And they have to discuss then the bullet hole in the governor's sleeve, because the bullet still has to go through his sleeve and his pants and come out whole. So once more, Mr. Fraser says the hole was in such condition due to the washing of the material, I can't determine what happened, or if it was caused by a bullet, or the direction of the path with reference to the entrance or exit. That is the FBI expert.
That's off the record.
No, they're back on the record now. Yeah,
I'm
and
sorry.
he says, I cannot determine the direction, if the hole was caused by a bullet or the direction of the path with reference to entrance or exit, because of the condition that the shirt sleeve is in, it's been dry cleaned. He's very cautious. He's been 23 years with the FBI, and he is not committing himself. And there's still another bullet hole in the trousers of the governor. And Mr. Fraser still said it had the appearance of a bullet hole, but I could not determine the direction of the bullet, if, in fact, it was even caused by the bullet. So the matter whether or not the governor's clothing was destroyed, as far as evidence, nobody goes into. Nobody asked the who or why. But Dr. Shaw, you go into the testimony of the doctors that operated on Governor Conley, and they think it's impossible that the bullet is doing what the Warren Commission is going to tell you it did. This is why the clothing is so important. When the doctors give their testimony, they say, well, for goodness sake, let's have the clothing. But the men who are in charge of the property that would prove that Oswald did it or find out who did the murder and the direction of the murders have destroyed the evidence. So Dr. Shaw, who operated on the governor's chest, on Governor Conley's chest, said that there were metal fragments in both the x-rays and the wrist of the governor that make it difficult to believe that the same missile could have caused the two wounds in Governor Conley. There's different kinds of metal. Now, you see, this is why it's important to get the x-rays of President Kennedy. Dr. Shaw, in Volume 6, page 113, says that there's metal fragments in the x-rays of the wrist of the governor that make it difficult to believe that the same missile caused the wounds in his body. And
that's a pretty significant statement there.
Well, yes. And it says there seems to be more than 3 grains of metal missing in his wrist alone. You see, we're going to have a bullet come out whole. Volume 6, page 113, he has metal from the bullet missing, and it doesn't match other fragments in the governor. With regards to the one bullet inflicting all the wounds of the governor, he said, I feel there would be some difficulty in explaining all of the wounds being inflicted by bullet 399 without causing more in the way of loss of substance to the bullet or deformation of the bullet. Remember, we talked about bullet 399. The important thing to remember is that one person is doing research on just the direction of the bullet. Bob Cutler, that was out here, has spent all this time, many years, just on the impossibility of that bullet doing it. But the doctors also are saying, the medical team that operate on John Conley are saying it's impossible, and the proof of whether it's possible or not is destroyed. This is the important thing, that the evidence in so many of these cases is destroyed. The doctor said, if the same bullet which went through President Kennedy went through Governor Conley's wrist, I can't quite place where his wrist at the time his chest was struck.
Where his wrist was at the time his chest was struck.
Yeah. Now
so the doctors have got some entirely different views on the single bullet theory.
Exactly. And then we go back again to Dick Sprague, who was our guest, who has the movies of his wrist and is trying to tell you that it was impossible for the single bullet to do all that they said it was doing. You see, the men that have worked so hard on the photographic evidence or on the ballistic evidence know that something's wrong because they're backed up by the testimony of the medical teams, you see. And always it's the government that's destroyed the evidence that would prove.
Okay, we'll be back discussing the evidence and the research around the John Kennedy assassination You're listening to Dialogue Assassination with political research specialist Mae Brussell. I'm Phil Kogan, and this is KLRB Carmel, Stereo 101.7, serving you 24 hours a day. Break about the medical evidence conflicting with the conclusions reached by the ballistics experts for the FBI. So let's pick that up again.
Yeah, well, in the commission hearings, which again you get at the Monterey Peninsula Library or from your Carmel Library or ask Monterey to order them, the 26 volumes of commission hearings where various people were called to testify about evidence of medical examinations and practical problems of criminology of who was committing these murders of Oswald or of John Kennedy. Dr. Shaw, in Volume 6, page 113, said he can't place where the wrist of Governor Conley would be at the time his chest was struck. Now, in Volume 4, on page 120 to 128, there's a Dr. Gregory, who also performed surgery on Governor Conley. He had surgery in the wrist, the leg, the chest, and Dr. Gregory performed surgery on his chest. And he was confused by the Warren Commission statements. And this is his statement. The only way the missile could have produced this wound, in my view, was to have entered the wrist backwards. The wounds he saw were not at all characteristic of an entry wound of a pristine missile, which tends to make a small wound of entrance and a larger wound of exit. And I would like to add that we were disconcerted by not finding a missile at all. Here was our patient with 3 discernible wounds and no missile within him of sufficient magnitude to account for them, and we suggested that someone ought to search his belongings in other areas. Now later they went out in a hall and found a full bullet on a stretcher that was supposed to come from John Conley, but they never could confirm the fact that he was on that stretcher. And this is documented. It was just a stretcher, and they're not sure who was even on that stretcher. And there are missiles still in him, particles in him, and Dr. Frazier was concerned about the variance of the different, he suggested it could be 2 different weapons. Now, his belongings, at this time that the doctor said they should search his belongings now were in a paper bag with Mr. Carter. When they were doing that surgery, the belongings that he refers to that would have been useful. And Dr. Shaw was performing the surgery on John Conley, and Conley's clothing were sitting in a room with Lyndon Johnson in 2 paper bags. Now, Dr. Shaw and Dr. Gregory gave the commission a hard time, and they wouldn't come to a conclusion of entry or exit wounds on the governor's wrist. And while the former wanted to make all the wounds from a single bullet, the Warren Commission, the ballistics, the x-rays didn't fit together. So finally, in desperation, Dr. Shaw came to one conclusion, to Arlene Specter. He says, well, get the suit of his. It'll help a lot. Can we get his suit? And Mr. Specter's answer was, well, we are going to examine the clothing if it's possible. Well, why wouldn't they have examined? You see, this hearing before the commission was in March or April when the doctors were called to testify. And I'm sure that they believe that the evidence hadn't been tampered with or altered. All you had to do is get the clothing and prove whether the doctors were right or the commission was right.
They hadn't tried at that point?
Oh, no. Oh, no. The clothing was, thrown off to Washington, the day of the murder of John Kennedy. And these men were giving their medical opinion based upon x-rays and surgical records of what happened to John Conley. You see, the x-rays of John Kennedy were locked up. They weren't even developed to solve the crime. The commission didn't even see them. But the doctors from John Conley are saying to Arlene Specter and the commission, it couldn't be the way you said it happened because they're trying to reword their medical findings that didn't fit what the commission wanted to say. So finally, Dr. Shaw says, we'll get the clothing. And then Arlene Specter says, well, if it's possible, we will. Well, how can you find out who did the murder without going through the actual physical evidence? So what happened all the way down the line. So the surgeons were asking for the garments, but the commission wasn't sure they could get them. But when they got them, the clothing had been dry cleaned and pressed. And they could never find out, nobody has ever found out what happened to the clothing. See, whether there was an entry hole in the governor's sleeve and so forth, or who sent it to the clinger. They never found out who sent the garment to the clinger, which dry clinger in Washington cleaned it and pressed it. Were these things delivered to the clinger, or did he pick them up? Were they left off by some particular person? Who paid the bill for the dry cleaning? You'd have a record of some of this stuff. These are things, I did this for an article to send in to a magazine on the clothing of John Conley. you break the Warren Commission down, it's like taking the hangnail of a body that, when your finger gets abscessed and your whole system, your hand is throbbing, the feeling your arm is hurting, and you have a sore. You just break down many of the pieces of evidence in this murder, and you could do chapters of books endlessly. And I did this for a chapter, an article. Wanting to know, well, who paid? Go to the dry cleaning place and find out who paid for it to be cleaned. And did Congressman Gonzalez pay for it? Was the bill sent to Mrs. Conley? Where are the clothing? So I looked up the testimony on Congressman Gonzalez. He was in the motorcade. He was at Parkland Hospital. He's the man who took the clothing. So you want to find out, how did he end up with the clothing? So I looked in volume 15 under Gonzalez. He was never called as a witness to testify before the Warren Commission. He ends up with the clothing of John Conley, but he's never called as a witness. So I looked up every reference to Mr. Congressman Gonzalez. He was mentioned in volume 6, volume 7, and volume 15. In volume 6, the nurse, the head nurse, Miss Stanbridge, gives testimony that she gave the clothing to Clifton Carter, who signed for it. And it was found in Representative Gonzalez's closet, but it was an indirect reference to Gonzalez. Miss Stanbridge just said, Clifton Carter, this is Lyndon Johnson's aide and pal, and was sitting in the emergency room, Parkland Hospital, got the clothing. In volume 7, Mr. Carter is called for a deposition. He was not a witness before the Warren Commission. And he made a deposition that Congressman Gonzalez sat in the room with him at Parkland Hospital. They said, who sat with you in that room? And he mentioned the people in the room. He makes no mention of signing for a paper bag or turning it over to anybody. He's not called as a witness. He simply fills out a piece of paper. The nurse has testified that she handed it to Clifton Carter. When he makes a deposition, he doesn't even mention receiving clothing of any kind. He just mentions he sat in a room. That's his deposition. In volume 15, a newspaper man mentions that he saw Congressman Gonzalez at Parkland Hospital. Those are the only 3 mentions of him out of 26 million words, 26 volumes, each 1,000 pages. There's no reference to the clothing at all, even when these people are interviewed.
So there's question as to who accepted the clothing and where it went after it left Parkland Hospital.
That's right. You see, after it left, the nurse simply turned it into a room where Lyndon Johnson was sitting, the clothing of Governor Conley. And then Clifton Carter, who received the bag, never is called as a witness, and no mention of Gonzalez as a witness before the Warren Commission at all. Now, they were in the motorcade. Gonzalez was in the motorcade. He sat with the president of Parkland Hospital. He returned to the Washington that same evening with the clothing of Governor Conley. And they never asked him who gave him the clothing, why Carter signed for it, why he handed it over to Gonzalez, how the clothing were found, by the dry cleaner, who signed for them. Did he have household help who sent them out, who laundered them, why the FBI didn't have them, why the Secret Service didn't have them. You see, I'm dwelling in detail on this particular item today because last week we did Bullet 399, and in a continuous pattern for people who are taping the shows or listening every week, and talking about destruction of evidence, I'm taking one thing to tie in with the current destruction of that memo and trying to show that what happened with John Conley's clothing that would help tell where the gunman stood in the John Kennedy murder. So then I wanted to find out about Clifton Carter. I looked up the testimony on Gonzalez. There was nothing, and I want to look up Clifton Carter. So I look in volume 15 of the commission hearings. There's an index of every witness that's called before the commissioner, an affidavit. And Clifton Carter was never called as a witness like Mr. Gonzalez. He was in the motorcade. He was at the hospital. He was never questioned. He went back with President Johnson to the White House. He slept at the White House that night. He's never called as a witness on why he received that clothing. He described the motorcade. He sent a letter to the Warren Commission called an affidavit, dated May the 20th, 1964. And he describes the motorcade, the shots, waiting at Parkland Hospital, boarding the plane, and he describes how he helped plan President Kennedy's trip to Texas, June the 5th, 1963. In El Paso, Texas, at the Cortez Hotel, June the 5th, 1963, Clifton Carter and Lyndon Johnson and 2 other gentlemen had a meeting, and that date they determined that John Kennedy would come to Dallas in the fall. They decided. And he's back. John Kennedy is dead. The occupant of the White House is out. Clifton Carter is sleeping with Lyndon Johnson, keeping him company the evening of the assassination. The clothing has been transferred. He signed for it. The evidence of the direction of the bullets, the amount of bullets, or helping decide how many bullets came, has been handed. This piece of evidence has been handed to Clifton Carter, given it to Gonzalez. He's not called as a witness. He isn't even asked to testify. Now, his name is only mentioned it's mentioned 5 times, Clifton Carter. Once where he describes the motorcade. The second time is where Agent Youngblood, that's the Secret Service agent that was with Vice President Johnson. He testified that Clifton Carter was in the follow-up car behind Vice President Johnson. Agent Youngblood is the man who jumped on top of Lyndon Johnson to protect him when the shots fired, and there were several pillows in Lyndon Johnson's car. Nobody knows why, but he was protected with pillows, and he didn't have a back problem or anything, but Youngblood was the man. He just mentioned Clifton Carter once. In Volume 5, Henry Wade mentioned Carter's name, only in reference because they got a call from Washington, from Clifton Carter. Have you found that person yet? Henry Wade is a district attorney at Dallas. And he called me and he said, are they making any progress in the case? Henry Wade, Volume 5, page 251, says, you see, Cliff Carter and I are close personal friends. Now, Henry Wade is the district attorney at Dallas who's going to close that case at a press conference Friday night. We have the lone assassin. It's Lee Harvey Oswald. And Clifton Carter, at that point that Henry Wade has a press conference in Dallas, Clifton Carter is with Lyndon Johnson in Washington, holding the clothing that would tell whether bullets came from the front or not. Volume 5, page 561, President Johnson mentions that Clifton Carter entered the surgical room at Parkland Hospital. Those are the only references to his name. And in Volume 6, page 111, Miss Stambridge, the nurse that we mentioned before, who mentions Mr. Gonzalez, said she went to the room where Vice President Johnson and his party were sitting. They opened the door and they asked for somebody. And he said he identified himself as Clifton Carter. They opened the door and they asked for somebody. And he identified himself as Clifton Carter. And she was told this was Governor Connolly's party sitting in that room. And Mrs. Connolly, the only member of Governor Connolly's party, really, was in the hall. His wife, I don't know what kind of a party Governor Connolly is having, but Lyndon Johnson and Gonzalez and Clifton Carter are sitting, and the Judge Thornburg, Lyndon Johnson's newly appointed judge in Texas, are sitting in this outside room. Now, it's interesting, Texas was going to investigate this particular crime. I wonder if that judge would have been the judge on the case. Clifton Carter received the clothing. Now, following this evidence that was destroyed, to recapitulate, Phil, I went into the research, and this took 8-9 years of nitpicking to go through all of this stuff. I've done this on so many aspects of the case. You go into what the doctor's testimony of why the clothing is important, the impossibility of what the Warren Commission happened. You go into who received the clothing, what happened to it, did they ever investigate it. The Warren Commission doesn't ask Congressman Gonzalez about his having that evidence destroyed. It doesn't ask what the nature of Governor Connolly's party was that was taking place, or Clifton Carter, why he signed for it, instead of the investigative agencies, the policemen signing for the garments, or Mrs. Connolly. It certainly doesn't belong to Lyndon Johnson, the clothing, why it was brought into that room. And this is what I call the chain of possession on evidence destroyed. You see, this is one sample of the kind of research I do. I've got a lot of it. That is the destruction of the evidence of the clothing. We've gone into the car interior and the street sign. Now, the crucial frames of the Zapruder film that are mentioned over and over again, many of those were lost, and Life magazine bought that immediately after the assassination, and they signed an affidavit saying they were spliced out. They didn't explain, but it's in the commission hearings that they were spliced out by their own admission. Now, there were notes taken in the Dallas jail, and this has been verified. From the time Oswald was arrested, the Dallas police had no tape recorder or device to keep track of what Oswald was saying in this Dallas jail for 48 hours before he was killed. But all those notes were thrown away. The Dallas policemen had no records. There is record that they took notes because Captain Fritz of Hope Inside would say, we took notes of this or notes of that. But after Oswald was dead, there were no notes taken
Let's explain the significance of that. First with the frames of the Zapruder films, which were spliced out and will never be seen, presumably, by anybody. What is the significance of not having those?
Well, because many people on the peninsula were fortunate enough to see a rerun of the Zapruder movie that we had out at Monterey Peninsula College. And for those of you who haven't, you can see single frames of him photographed in Life magazine or in the commission hearings. The significance was that the bullet direction seemed to show, based on the law of physics, that John Kennedy's head was thrown backwards when he was hit the fatal bullet, which means that the direction of the gunman was to the right of him and somewhat to the front, and not from behind on the 6th floor. When the Warren Commission printed the frames by frame of the killing of John Kennedy, they renumbered them and later admitted when the book came out that they had his head going forward frame by frame, admitted they put them in the wrong era. So the Warren Commission hearings in the volumes have photographs of John Kennedy's head, each frame going forward a little bit more. And then
so they reversed it to make it appear differently.
Yeah, and then they admitted that they had printed them in reversal. They numbered them, but they printed them not in the right number. The numbers are there, but it's printed in a reversal thing.
So it gives you, in looking at it, it gives you the opposite impression.
That's right. If you flick it, it looks like his head's going forward. And actually it was going backwards. So they printed them with a reversal. And the important thing about deleting these particular films, that they were spliced out, when you have a movie, one reason that it's important to find out what happened is I have a whole document that another woman was hit and fell down. She was behind the car, over opposite the grassy knoll, at the curb facing the book depository, across the street from the depository. And in some frames, there's a frame where this woman is standing on the curb, and there's another one where she's down on the grass. And it was a color movie, and I have the documents of research where they reconstructed the pictures, even of the Zapruder thing. If you look carefully, it looks like there's blood, that she's been hit. And so
have they ever found that woman?
No. They've never located her, but you see her standing on the curb, then you see her down on the ground, and it looks like she's been hurt. There were several people that fell to the ground, and you missed the movies that night, you were out of town, where he shows immediately after John Kennedy's car went down the street and went on to Parkland Hospital, about 12 feet from where the fatal bullet would have hit him as the car went around that particular curve, it shows a Secret Service man, an FBI man, lean down on the grass and pick up an object and put it in their pocket. And the only assumption is it's a shell. They were identified as members of the Bureau, see, and they put something in their pocket. So to delete it, you may show somebody else that was hit. In the confusion of that moment, she could have been taken off for hospital care and just, no one has ever seen her.
So there was the significance of the deletion of the part of the Zapruder films. Now, you mentioned that the notes taken about Oswald and his behavior, what he was doing during those 48 hours that he was in the Dallas jail and alive, those notes were destroyed. Now,
completely destroyed.
Now, if those notes were available, what would they say?
Well, let's give you an inkling of what they would say. When Oswald was taken to a press conference, they had a meeting that Henry Wade called late Friday night, in the basement of the jail, where Jack Ruby described himself as the entrepreneur of the Dallas jail. He was the master of ceremonies for the news media down there that night. Walking from the corridors to the room and back to his room, and in the halls were newspeople, and they picked up this kind of thing. They heard him say, "I'm only a patsy." They heard him say, "I didn't kill anybody." They heard him yell out, if they asked him about a rifle with a picture of his head on a body, and the body was holding the rifle and the pistol and the militant, communist literature. He said, "That's not my head. The picture's been superimposed." He had an interview with his brother, and the brother said, "Looks like you're in trouble, Lee." And Lee said, "Don't believe all that evidence." He said, "I didn't kill anyone. I didn't own a rifle. I'm a patsy." These are various things that he was saying. So you can imagine what went on in the Dallas jail for 48 hours before he was killed.
Of course, those are some of the things that you would expect a man to say that's, been apprehended for the murder of a president, to not admit that he did it.
Well, that's all right. You could say that those are the normal things for him to say, but if you're going to destroy the evidence that would prove his innocence or guilt, it gets back to what Mr. Tunney said again about the ITT memo. The very fact that you destroy things, let's read what John Tunney said this week. Under common law, when a person destroys evidence, they say it is a presumption of guilt. If the Dallas police and the FBI and the CIA are destroying the evidence of Lee Harvey Oswald's associations or contacts, you have to ask why, because so much evidence was destroyed. If it was just one thing, if just the police records were destroyed and everything else were intact, you'd have a clear-cut case against Oswald. You see, there's a law in the post office that 2 years from the day you fill out an application for your P.O. box, they save that slip. And you sign the name of who receives mail at your box. You have a P.O. box in Carmel. And you have permission for you and your wife to receive your mail, right? And if somebody else receives it, their name is on that slip. So if you receive a package under the name of Heidel to your box, such as a rifle, and somebody has to have permission to receive that package. You see, and when they called Postmaster Holmes about the application slip, could a rifle come under the name Heidel, the post office application was destroyed. Now, it's a federal law that has to be kept for 2 years, so somebody should be prosecuted. See, we're talking now, I've only brought in a list of 11 pieces of evidence because there isn't any more time. We could go into about 30 more things. We could continue this next week. But the post office slip was destroyed. Now, Oswald had a passport. In volume 23, page 188, they had a passport that he had applied for, and they had Exhibit C was one time accompanied by a document marked secret. And the Warren Commission wanted to know what was on this passport that was marked secret. So the document was accompanied with a message from the CIA, and Exhibit C indicates that the copy in Oswald's passport file was accidentally destroyed November the 23rd, 1963, while it was being thermofaxed. You like that one? I mean,
the day after the assassination.
The day after the assassination, his passport papers that had been marked secret were accidentally burned by thermofaxing. And this is at the passport office. Now, we have the name of a man in State Department who had Lee Harvey Oswald's papers on his desk the day of the assassination. November the 23rd, 1963, his passport papers that were marked secret were thermofaxed.
What were the papers doing on this person's desk that you mentioned the day of the assassination?
Well, Oswald was an agent of the CIA and the FBI, and they were pulling these papers out. I'm sure that some people dislike these memos of the ITT. You see, Jack Anderson comes out with certain charges of a deal that's being made to stop this huge corporation from gobbling up more billions of dollars of how do you describe the conglomerates that get together, and join to push out all small companies that are trying to exist in the United States. And when Jack Anderson comes out with a memo on February the 23rd, the evidence in Dita Beard's office is destroyed February 24th. Now the same thing happens with Lee Harvey Oswald. You see, the news today isn't any different than then, but people weren't aware of it then, and a lot of people don't have access to this is why I'm on the air, to share my research of what's happening. Now, we know that the autopsy notes were burned when the Warren Commission came out with 2 autopsies. The FBI had one version, that one bullet went finger length and didn't go through, which would account for another hole in John Kennedy's body. The Navy doctor at Bethesda came out with an altogether different autopsy paper, and many people are familiar with the destruction of the autopsy paper by Dr. Hume. And this is why I spend so much time on the other things, because we know, or maybe a lot of people are not familiar with the fact that they ended up with 2 autopsy reports that were different from each other, and the x-rays of the body hadn't been examined to prove which one was right or wrong, and they're locked up for your lifetime if you want it to be that way. But when they called Dr. Hume to testify, he said he burned them in his fireplace. Did he take them home with him, and he destroyed his original autopsy by burning. Maybe his original autopsy matched the FBI autopsy, which would mean then that Oswald was not the lone assassin if he was the assassin at all. It meant there were more gunmen, because reconstructing the crime, you couldn't do that many shots in the time period allotted.
I'm talking about this evidence, Mae. You've mentioned that some of this is locked up for your lifetime if you want it that way. You've said that a couple of times.
Yeah.
Maybe you should reiterate again what you're saying.
Well,
you said it on other programs.
Oh, yeah. What I'm trying to say is that when the Warren report was out, Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States at the time, announced that much of the evidence that the commission used would be locked up for the lifetime of every person living at that particular, it was 1964, 75 years this material would be locked up. And I say it'll be locked up if you want it. If you don't want it that way, you can begin writing to your congressman and putting pressure and letting them know, letting the candidates know what is happening and that you're not completely stupid as to these murders. We got a letter last week. A listener and her husband who listen to the radio shows here wrote to McGovern. They took my suggestion, and they wrote to McGovern and said there is this particular person out on the peninsula who says there was a conspiracy to kill John Kennedy, and she has the information, and would you open up the National Archives, and what is your position? And they mentioned Bud Fensterwald from the Committee to Investigate Assassinations. Let me read that letter that they got back. This is a letter asking McGovern, your candidate for President of the United States, what would he do? This is an election year. There's evidence of a conspiracy. Would he consider opening up this evidence and finding out who killed John Kennedy, and that there is this Mr. Fensterwald in Washington with the Committee to Investigate Assassinations? Now, here's the letter they received. Dear Mr., I'll leave the name off the air here, thank you for your recent letter. It is good to know of your support as we prepare for the critical primary in Wisconsin on April the 4th. We have received a good deal of information from Mr. Fensterwald and his committee, and I am pleased to know of your interest in his activities. With every good wish, I am sincerely George McGovern. Now, these people mentioned that there is a committee to investigate assassinations headed by Bernard Fensterwald, the attorney for James Ray, to find out who killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. What would he do, they asked, if he were elected president to get the information to the people? And McGovern says, I have information from Fensterwald, and I'm pleased to know of your interest in his activity. Now, this couple on the Monterey Peninsula didn't want to write to George McGovern and tell them that they're interested in Fensterwald. They asked McGovern, would he open up the truth of who killed John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King? And he skirts around that with absolutely no commitment. But the point is this. He knows that Bud Fensterwald exists, and he knows that the Committee to Investigate Assassinations is pressing for Congress to take a new investigation into the legislative body, into Congress, the executive. Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon control the information now, and they control the power as the president and past president. And it's up to you to ask the Congress, like Richard Nixon isn't investigating the ITT case. He's involved in it. The Senate Judiciary is investigating it, not the executive branch. There's a difference. So if all of you would write, like this particular couple, write to George McGovern, write to anybody, and let them know you're not completely stupid, that this thing is growing out here and that you're aware and that you're absorbing facts and information, and let them know you're not stupid, maybe if they get enough letters like this, things will begin to change. You know, when I came in, you were excited about the decision of the Jackson, the Soledad trial of the boys up in San Francisco this week, Phil. And I can tell you that a handful of people on this peninsula, and I can name them on this show, and we could do a show about them, kept that thing going when the first shootout took place out on the grounds at Soledad. And we said that was a political thing. They were aiming for Jackson on the ground that day, George Jackson, and that was a political ambush to get those boys. Done by the personnel and the guards. No one would believe us. They thought we were loony. And a handful of people on this Monterey Peninsula have worked very, very hard, keeping the interest going, generating, getting the truth, digging this thing out till it became a national thing. And you begin to find truth where it really is. You see, and you can be proud of that case. And you can, just like the Soledad thing was reversed, the people listening to this show want the information that's locked up for 75 years. You will get that information if you keep pressing. People do have the power. I'm not as discouraged as you are about some of these things. I think they have the power to keep things moving.
I guess we should say, in wrapping things up, that if you want to write to a representative, or if you want to write to Mae about the program, that you can write care of the station, KLRB, Box 3904 in Carmel, or they can write directly to you if they want, I guess.
Yes, or Wednesday night, the Democratic candidates are going to be in the Carmel area, or whenever they pass through town. Interview them. Say, would you open up the Warren Commission hearings? We have evidence of a conspiracy. We know people who have. What are you going to do? Pressure the Democrats, the Republican, the peace and freedom, the states' rights. They're on record for opening up the Warren Commission.
Okay, that's Dialogue Assassination for this Saturday. Thanks for joining us.